Lady Jane Grey's time and place of birth has been a source of dispute. Initially it has always been thought that Jane was born at Bradgate Park in Leicestershire around October 1537. But more recently it has been claimed that she may have been born as early as February 1537 but no later than May in London. Unfortunately, official birth records were not kept at this time, but calculations of her time of birth are based on the date of her execution when she was 17. Jane was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, Princess Mary, and one of the king's best friends, Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. Jane also had two younger sisters, Lady Catherine and Lady Mary. They were all grandnieces to Henry VIII, great-granddaughters of Henry VII and cousins to Edward VI, Mary I and Elizabeth I, which gave them all a remote link to the line of succession. Jane was an academic, preferred to study rather than follow other popular traditions such as hunting. Jane had a broad education, including learning Greek, Latin and Hebrew from her humanist tutor John Aylmer and learning Italian from Michelangelo Florio. She became a committed Protestant from her education with Aylmer and from the influence of her father. In February 1547, Jane would become an attendant to Henry VIII's widow, Catherine Parr, at Sudderley Castle in Gloucestershire. Jane would stay here, with the uncle of Edward VI, Thomas Seymour, until Catherine's death from childbirth in 1548, where Jane would become chief mourner at Catherine's funeral. Jane would stay here, with the uncle of Edward VI, Thomas Seymour, until Catherine's death from childbirth in 1548, where Jane would become chief mourner at Catherine's funeral. Thomas Seymour would be arrested in 1548 and Jane's father would be interrogated continually by the Lord Council prior to Seymour's execution. It was at this time that Jane would be forwarded as to many suitors in marriage. At one stage her father proposed her as a bride to the Lord Protector's Edward Seymour's son, Lord Hertford. Eventually Jane would become engaged to Lord Guildford Dudley, a son of John Dudley, the first Duke of Northumberland, in 1553. The Duke of Northumberland was one of the most powerful men in the country and was the Lord President of the King's Council from 1549. The ceremony at Durham House on the 25th of May 1553 would be a triple wedding. Her sister Catherine and Catherine would marry Lord Herbert, and the sister of Lord Guildford, Catherine, would marry Henry Hastings, heir to the Earl of Huntingdon. In 1544 the Third Succession Act restored both Elizabeth and Mary, the daughters of Henry VIII, to the line succession. The act was very specific in stating that if none of his children should have an heir, then the throne would be passed to the heirs of his younger sister Mary. This would include naming Jane as a possible future heir, but did not name Jane's mother Frances nor any of the Scottish descendants from his older sister Margaret, who had married King James IV of Scotland. In the summer of 1553 a dying Edward VI named in his will that his heir should be Lady Jane Grey, and thus bypassing the heir presumptive, Mary, who was his Catholic half-sister. The reason behind this move was probably orchestrated by Duke of Northumberland in order to preserve a Protestant as the English monarch, even though Edward VI personally supervised the copying of his will, which was notarized by the Privy Council amongst others, and for the declaration to be passed in Parliament in September. Edward would pass away at the age of 15 on the 6th of July 1553. There would be a delay of 4 days though before the announcement of his death, for reasons which remain unknown. Could the delay be due to the uncertainty of who should inherit the throne? Lady Jane Grey was informed she was now the Queen at the age of 16, on the 9th of July 1553. The next day she would take up residence in the Tower of London. On the same day she was proclaimed Queen of England, France and Ireland whilst she awaited her coronation. It is believed that Jane had refused to name her husband as king. In the days that followed, the Duke of Northumberland had a race against time to capture Mary Tudor, who had set out to East Anglia to rally supporters for her claim to the throne. Also, between the 10th and the 19th of July, an enemy of Northumberland, Henry Fitzalan, the 19th Duke of Arundel, managed a coup in the Privy Council whilst Northumberland was away seeking to arrest Mary. The Duke of Arundel had managed to persuade the Privy Council to change their minds to proclaim Mary as Queen. Both Jane and her husband was arrested on the 19th of July and taken to two different towers within the Tower of London. The Duke of Northumberland was executed on the 22nd of August 1553. In September, Jane was declared an usurper in spite of the declaration of the will of Edward VI, and Mary Tudor was declared the rightful heir to the throne. At her trial on the 13th November 1553, Jane was referred to as Jane Dudley. All the defendants at the trial were found guilty of treason, which included Jane, her husband, two of her husband's brother and the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Jane's execution was to be burned alive or beheaded at the pleasure of Queen Mary. Initially Jane's life was to be spared on the orders of Queen Mary. But following the Thomas Wyatt the Younger rebellion in January 1554, which was a protest against Mary's plan to marry King Philip of Spain, forced the government to act and follow through with the plan to execute Lady Jane. Jane was taken from the Tower to be beheaded at Tower Hill on the 12th of February 1554. Jane would blindfold herself before being taken to the block and need assistance to find it. She would be beheaded with one clean stroke of the axe. Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, would be executed 11 days later on the 23rd of February 1554. Her mother, the Duchess of Suffolk, would be fully pardoned and would go on to remarry and still be allowed to live at court. Jane is buried with her husband in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the grounds of the Tower of London.